He called the place the end of the map because maps had long since ceased to be useful there. Where his satellite transponders still pinged, and where old star charts bored clean arcs through the upper atmosphere, there were curtains of static and blank coordinates. Places the surveyors had drawn an X across and advised future travelers to skirt. Kellen had lived under that X for 10 years and 3 months, an engineer turned curator with a stubborn set of habits left like barnacles on a hull. Refill the recycler, check the pressure seals. Sweep the dust from the central console at dawn, when the thin, orange light pooled like tea across his workbench. He measured time in maintenance cycles, and the slow decay of the living systems the outpost still limped on. The scrubbers that had a habit of sighing and failing in the heat, the algae tanks that sometimes refused to feed, the thin, rare rain, the atmospheric condensers bled out once every dozen days. It was enough to keep him breathing, to keep the station what used to be a research sentinel functioning. If only well enough, the planet they had settled on called itself Nothing Worth Repeating, a name in the old dialect that meant something between ash and iron. Its winters hammered with crystalline winds that cut like knives. Its summers were slow and hot, the soil reluctant to remember its own fertility. Once this place had been a test bed. Crops, seeds, a scattering of human ambition planted to bloom an alien sun. They had sent out teams, grants, vocations. They had built machines to coax life where the planet would not be generous. But projects are always governed by the currency of politics and time. The supply lines thinned. The funding dried. The ships that ran the long circuits stopped coming when the planets on the other side of the system grew louder with crises. Over a handful of generations, the scientific optimism had shrunk into an archive, and then into an argument that had been lost. People left. Whatever had not been taken, records, DNA samples, the paleotanks and the living incubators, was abandoned, preserved by the slow, stubborn mechanical intelligence that had idealized failure and refused to let it go. Kellen had not been the sort to leave. He had come to the outpost with a backpack and a face weathered by one failed marriage and the neat fatalism of a man who had been good with machines and poor with people. The station offered him sanctuary from an economy that had no use for his kind of labor anymore, no use for someone who could coax a failing pump into another season of life. Here, among the glass and metal and the stubborn green of algae tanks, he felt the world was simpler. He could be small and routine, and in that smallness, quiet. He collected the remnant data drives like a priest collects relics, sequences of bursts and blips, hologram fragments, whispered interviews with people who had died in transit, logistical logs that smelled faintly of an optimism they could not keep. He cataloged them in a bone-soft way, reading the old paperless journals with a protective severity, as if he were the only one left who could keep the memory of the project honest. He was the archive, and he was the janitor, and sometimes, he told himself, he was the last audience for a half-forgotten choir in the early evening. When the light outside turned the horizon into a thin coin, and the heat haze made the air shimmer with secrets, he heard something he had stopped expecting. New footsteps on an old pad. The sound was a soft, uncertain thing at first metal on composite. The awkward shuffle of something unfamiliar in the gravity and then a voice that was not his, filled the air with a syllabic cadence like a recorded echo. He stood, felt the old reflex of muscle and pain, and went to the hatch. When the hatch cycled open, there was a woman in the doorway who did not quite look like any human Kellen had ever seen. It would have been easier for him if she had been ugly, less complicated to dismiss. But she was built with an economy of grace that made his lungs forget their rhythm. Not the classic soft symmetry that had once dictated beauty on pre-collapse holoscreens. Instead, there was something honed in her lines, as if nature had been taught to be efficient, and then, after being taught, had learned how to be beautiful again. Her skin caught the pale light and seemed to hold it like thin porcelain. Her hair, cropped close to the skull, bore a faint iridescence. Veins of a muted silver traced near-surface patterns beneath her temples, like the wiring of a very delicate instrument. She moved with a careful deliberation, as if she were measuring the weight of the air and deciding whether it would be kind. her voice, when she spoke, bore no accent Kellen could place. It carried technical precision and something like wonder. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said. "I am looking for the archive." There was a metric in her speech that suggested either education or rehearsal. Either way, it was an economy of language Kellen could appreciate. "You found it," he said. His voice surprised him with its ordinary dryness. He watched her like someone watching a delicate animal approach a wound. "You shouldn't be out here." "The storms we tracked the meteorological envelope," she interrupted gently, not unkindly. "There are windows." She inclined her head. "My name is Mara." Dames, in that small moment, felt like the most dangerous currency. He said his Kalanen. They exchanged that fragile business of identification, like two survivors at a crossing. She told him, without unnecessary ceremony, that she had been traveling alone and that her ship had listed and bled out near the western ridge. Her arrival was not corresponded by a fleet or colonino. Rescue beam flickered on his console. She had come on her own, and by hard luck found him. She asked for shelter, and he gave it because he was a man who knew how to be useful. He fed her the remaining ration cakes and warmed the soup that was thick with algae and medicinal herbs. She accepted the food with a kind of gratitude that had teeth. Over the next days measured in maintenance cycles, in the careful way he liked to count, she wandered through the archive, as a person would wander through a grave, and began to read. Logs unspooled in the dim red lights. Files on gene expression. On cryoviability. On the grand experiments that had once been the station's pride. Kellen watched her watch the past, and he saw the mechanical flicker of emotion across her face. He saw curiosity and an old, ragged grief. It took a week for the reason she had come to unclench into a sentence. One evening in the archive hall, the station humming low and the algae tanks flashing their idiosyncratic bioluminescence, she said, "Without preamble, we have no means to gestate our children." The room swallowed the words as if they were a stone dropping into water. Kellen set down the datapad he was cleaning. "I don't follow." Mara bent over a table scattered with sample vials, the plastic tags catching the light. "My people, our descendants, lost the capacity to carry offspring." It was not a single failure. It was a programmatic collapse across the reproductive networks. We turned to bioassembly, and for a while it worked. But then the forges failed. The genome scaffolding we used to trigger embryogenesis degenerated. We relocated to enclaves and later to starships. We tried to synthesize, to splice, to use machines. We failed. The last functioning gestation chambers are old tech. They require a catalyst sequence. She hesitated. There was a fracture of something in her voice that made the room colder. "And that sequence exists in humans," Kellen finished for her. The words came too easily, like a thing he'd been holding between his teeth. Her gaze lifted to him. And in that moment, she looked suddenly, achingly young. Yes. It was absurd how a single piece of code, a pattern in a double helix, could sit like a talisman and hold within it the fate of a species. It felt like myth, like ritual, until Kellen remembered the old sample drives he had tucked away in the sub-basement. A handful of genomes grafted from the earliest colonists who had arrived with the project. He had treated them like a curiosity, more than prophecy, a small vault of human DNA, labeled with patient clinical tags, stored and kept in a deactivated cryobank. Scientists, in their hubris, seeded their work with everything they thought might be useful, a library of genetic scaffolds, a collection of alleles that could be folded into alien constructs. Kellen had never quite understood why humans had been chosen as scaffolds. We are all landlocked in our own history, he had thought. But then that was how science often worked. Borrow what is known to build what is unknown. Mara told him about the chambers. Ancient devices that could cradle life like a machine cradles a child. Devices that needed a catalytic pattern to complete the gestation arc. Without a human sequence to prime the scaffolding, the chambers would grow cold and sterile. She had traveled across systems to reach the outpost because somewhere in the station's archives there was, perhaps, that pattern. She suspected the vault would be here. She had read the fragmentary inventory the station's previous occupants had left to the net, a handful of human samples. one of them noted as intact pre-collapse. That phrase, robotic and imprecise, had become the rivet she rode on. Kellen had never pictured himself as a linchpin of anything larger than his own loneliness. But as Mara explained in measured sentences, interlaced with technical warmth, the gravity of the request anchored itself into his sternum. He could have refused. He could have closed his door and let her leave with the night. He could, as many had done before him, rationalize himself into inertia. Instead, he led her to the sub-basement, to the cryo-vault. The vault was a small room with a door that groaned like an animal when power cycled. Inside, a single array of capsules glinted in pallid light. The human samples had been arranged in neat rows, labeled and cataloged in a 10-year-old hand. There were names, no, not names, but codes and trial tags attached to each vial: HO1, HO2, HO4. Kellen keyed into the console and traced the inventory. There, near the bottom of the list, a line read, HO7 intact, complete sequence, donor unknown. Note, variant A7 present. I turned to Mara and watched her face in the dim glow of the cryo chamber. There was a peculiar, private tremor in her expression, relief braided with sorrow. A7, she murmured. The variant that had the splice compatibilities? The older tech used it sometimes in cross-species scaffolding. Kellen felt something like vertigo. You mean we need it? She said simply. We need the sequence as a chimera prime. The chamber uses it to seed the scaffold. Without a human genomic catalyst, it's inert. With it, with it, we might restore our gestation cycles. Restoration. The word had a small religious weight to it. In the slow, dietary light of the archive, Kellen felt the walls of his life open and reveal a corridor he had not intended to walk. He looked at the vial the way a man looks at the last remaining root of a plant in winter, fragile, beautiful, too important to touch without trembling. Why me? He asked, why come to my place? You were on the map, she said without irony. The coordinates were old. The maintenance logs were preserved. It was a long shot. But in a long universe, long shots become necessities. She smiled, a very small thing, and the honesty of it was like a tune played in a minor key. And because you had old human stock, Kellen's hands were sudden with the want to walk away, to protect the samples, to clutch them like an old man clutches an heirloom. It wasn't just fear for the vials, though there was that. A fear tinged with legitimate greed for the world's last remnants of unmodified human code, but the understanding that to hand over a sequence was to hand over the possibility of new beings, made in the mirror of biological need. What happens when the dead are asked to make the living? He had seen enough of humanity in the raw to know that making life could destroy as easily as it could rescue. He asked the only sensible question he had left in him. What's the catch? Mara's reply was a thing of functional brevity. The chamber requires the presence of a live biological signature during priming. It doesn't take a DNA image. It needs an active physiological interface. There is an algorithmic handshake that reads more than base pairs. It reads what we might call epigenetic context, metabolic echoes, biochemical microfluctuations that occur only in living tissue. We cannot synthesize that from a vial. We need a living donor within proximity to the chamber during the priming. Her voice dropped. We need someone whose biology will complete the handshake. Kellen's throat tightened, and for the first time he felt the full absurd weight of what she asked. Not that he would be used, he was used to being used by systems and engines, but that his living body might be the literal key to starting a Genesis engine. He pictured, with a clarity that made his hands cold, the slow opening of an ancient bay, the hum of coils waking, the silvered interior of a gestation pod like a cathedral that had been abandoned in faith and was now being reconsecrated with a living heart. The thought held a terrible holiness. Will it hurt? He asked, because it was practical and because his curiosity needed anchoring to rational fear. It will be intimate, Mara said, not sexual. The interface requires proximity and the detection of your physiological rhythms. It requires trust. There will be monitoring. There will be data. But it will not be a physical violation if you do not consent to that. We cannot force a body into the loop. Her eyes were steady, uncompromising. We only ask. There is a peculiar moment of decision in human life when time narrows to a single approach and all the smaller things, old grievances, debts, the taste of the food, fall away. Kellen took that moment like a breath in and then offered a small, ridiculous smile. I don't have anything left to lose, he said. The admission sounded like an echo in a wide room. He had been a man with habits, with the slow bomb of routine. And yet that same routine had made his life into a small, featureless island. He felt older than the boxes of samples surrounding him, and sicker in the marrow than he liked to admit. If I help and it works, your species survives. If it fails, well, he did not finish. Mara's smile in return was quicksilver, a flicker of gratitude made real. Then we will try. The chamber lay 2 kilometers east of the outpost, sunk into a strip of plain the colonists had once used for field experiments. It was a relic from a project that had, in its time, married biology to machine with a hubris that later historians called tragic and engineers called brilliant. Approaching it was like approaching a tomb. The door was scarred with rust and solar wind. The interior smelled faintly of ozone and antiseptic, and the control arrays still hummed with a low, abiding pulse. Kellen had climbed down into it once before to retrieve technical manuals and to satisfy a long-forgotten itch. The pods inside were glassed and quiet, as if they had only been waiting for someone to come and say a proper prayer. Mara interfaced with the chamber like a person greeting an old friend. She danced with its ports and ribbons of code like someone reciting an old litany. For all her poise, she was not a priest. She was a technician of grief who had learned how to be practical about miracles. Kellen watched the way she moved, and he noticed the dawning and crippling tenderness that she always kept her hands visible. There was an ascetic neatness to her, no bracelets, no ornament, to only the careful instruments she carried on a belt. The priming protocol was a long list of small cruelties, stabilizing thermal gradients, calibrating the hormone analogs, isolating the chamber from electromagnetic interference that would phase the sequences into chaos. It required them to be in the room together during the handshake because the chamber measured more than DNA, it measured presence, the nuance of living chemistry. When the time came and Kellen sat on the low bench, bare-armed and feeling suddenly very young and very terrified, the pod's glass shone like a mirror. He had imagined foolishly that the process would be clinical, a thin exchange of data and a cascade of light. Instead, it was intimate in the way some religious rituals are intimate. You do not touch the center of the right, but you feel yourself fold into it. The pod's sensors lay against him like the gentle attention of an instrument. It read pulse and breath, the micro-variability of ions in his sweat. It listened to his heart, not as a heart, but as a vibrational signature. Kellen felt the machine take a sample of himself not as a clean needle, but as a long, patient etching. When the chamber began to translate, modules within it activated with the soft hiss of ancient hydraulics and the fluorescence of internal screens painted their faces in slow green gradients. Mara stood at the console, her silhouette an atlas of small, necessary movements. The chamber interfaced with the cryovial through fibers that hummed like strings. The sample activation sequence began to unfold like a language that had been dormant too long. For a moment, Kellen felt outside himself, a spectator in his own body as the instruments read his rhythms and compared them to the data in the vial. There was a fragility to the process that made the room feel full of dust motes and prayer. Then the chamber faltered. It was a tiny hiccup in error prompt flickering across an antique monitor. But in the small theater of their endeavor, it felt apocalyptic. Alarms coughed and then settled into a steady, worried chirp. The chamber's internal temperature drifted by a degree, and the conversion algorithm returned an anomaly code Kellen had only ever read on fragmentary logs. Compatibility drift, epigenetic mismatch. Mara's hands did not lift from the console, her jaw set. It will recalibrate, she said, but she sounded like someone who was telling a lie to keep the room calm. We have to continue the handshake. We abort now, the scaffold collapses. Kellen felt his body align to her words with the same mechanical patience he had once given to a failing pump. He concentrated on the sound of his breath, on the tick of his joints, on the small animal courage of a man who is not as brave as circumstances require. The chamber, apparently unforgiving of human sentiment, demanded precision. For 3 hours they held that strange, fragile position. Mara at the deck, Kellen as a living key set into an ancient machine. His body became a new kind of instrument. He felt his muscles relax into that knowledge, and then tense at the pain that came from being still for too long. The second activation was better. The algorithm rerouted around the drift. The chamber settled into its hermit song, and, in the dim green light, a hologram blossomed like an old-world memory. A small, flickering field of images and voice logs that had been attached to the original cryosample. They watched, almost by force. Old faces speak in archival tones, in voices made small by repetition and time. A researcher, long dead, talked about the variant A7 as if it were a promising mole of hypothesis rather than a talisman. It bridges certain splice sites with stabilizing motifs, the log said. It synergizes with xenobiotic scaffolders in a way we don't yet fully understand. Another file played of a woman laughing. Her grin was young and careless, and for Kellen, unbearably human. When the chamber finally hummed, with a steady, clean level of assurance, its internal lights a muted confidence. Mara allowed herself to breathe for the first time in the long night. "It will take time," she said. "We must let the scaffold fold." They slept on benches in the softly humming machine's outer room, the station, like a slow beast, breathing outside. In sleep, Kellen dreamed of seedlings and of hands that did not tremble. He dreamed of a future that felt uncanny as a photograph of a live coral reef in a museum. Colors that belonged to life, but were now arranged in neat cages. The days that followed were not cinematic in any conventional sense. They were a sequence of small technical calibrations and larger, more violent human adjustments. The prime scaffold, when alive, demanded different nutrients than the station could provide. They scavenged pumps and redirected flow. They harvested algae with a surgeon's reverence and folded it into nutrient blends. The gestation process, though the chamber manufactured the environment for a developing embryo of another species, required constant monitoring of ionic gradients and hormonal analogs that the colonists had invented, then discarded. Mara taught Kellen how to read the logs, and he, with the slow competence of a man who had once been paid to coax failing engines back into life, learned in the interim. They explored the archive together in a new intimacy. As the chamber annealed, logs opened like shells revealing the old colony's private history. They found messages that broke the good skin of their mutual understanding. A field report from a woman who had been a geneticist on the project, writing about the ethical dissonance of using human sequences to prime alien gestation. "We borrowed so many things from ourselves," she recorded, voice thick with irony and exhaustion. "We thought it would be a kindness to force continuity where it had no claim. We treated otherness as a material resource. We thought we had consent because we labeled it experimental." Mara read that log out loud at one point, a quaver in the corners of her voice that Kellen couldn't attribute to any machine. "Do you think they consented?" she asked him later, beneath the low lights of the maintenance corridor. Kellen did not answer immediately. The question lodged in him like a burr. He thought of the sample vials and the bureaucratic neatness of their tagging. He thought of the absent people whose genomic sequences had been plucked and archived. "Some did," he said finally, "because the truth seldom conforms to the dramatic pattern one expects. Some signed releases. Some were in favor because they'd seen collapse in other economies, and they thought this was an investment. Others were drafted and didn't understand the scale of what was being done. Consent is a thin fabric when you are worried about hunger or freezing." Mara listened with a patience that had no scorn. "We are the sum of those choices," she said quietly. "We have their consequence in our bones," the archive produced. In its inexorable way, traces of lives that had been ordinary and small. Food lists. Lovers' quarrels caught in private logs. A child's laughter captured on a humidity sensor. Between the technical logs and these human confessions, Kellen watched the woman in the doorway become less another and more a mirror. She had been a technician when she came. She unfurled into a being who could hold both engineering and loss in the same line. Sometimes she would sit on the floor in the dim reading room and read, aloud fragments of old literature that had been preserved in the station's educational cache. She liked the small human things. She liked splices of old poetry that read like prescriptions. To make of absence a future one must be prepared to be absent. As the scaffold matured in the chamber, there was a small change in Mara that Kellen noticed with a kind of careful alarmism. She grew quieter in a way that suggested a person listening to something a distance away. She began to wake at odd hours and walk to the outer windows and watch the planet's rim, as if expecting a ship to appear in the stripe of dim. He did not ask her why she did it. He had his own rituals to tend, but it was impossible not to sense that the fate of many was now focused through the narrow tunnel of their experiment, and that weight had a way of changing the substance of a person. One night, 2 months into the activation sequence, and with the chamber humming like a living animal in continence, Mara played a personal log for him. It was a message she had recorded before she left whatever enclave she had been exiled from. She sat on the deck of a commuter ship in the video, and her face was younger, less measured. "If you find this," the recorded Mara said, "then things have gone the softer path or the harder one. I don't know which. But if this reaches someone who can still be surprised by music and shame in the length of a horizon, then I am asking for one thing: don't make our children into monuments." Her recorded voice cracked on the last phrase. "Don't let them be reverent because we were dead. Let them be alive because life is what we teach them to do. And if you can, find someone to laugh with them." Kellen watched the recording and realized, with a sting, how small gestures anchor larger decisions. The recorded plea sat like moonlight on the ledger of what they were doing. A prescription for a future that might not need to be stitched to its tragedies. The major twist came in a way. It was neither theatrical nor gentle. One morning, the chamber's external sensors registered a trace: metallic debris on the far side of the western ridge. A glint on the satellite cam that could, with generous heart, be anything. Mara, who had been watching the horizon like a mother watching a sea, spun toward the console. "Ship signature," she breathed. "We are being scanned." Kellen felt something like a small animal's hope run through him. The logs they had been reading, the messages sequestered in the archive, always ended in a kind of practical loneliness. Memos sending condolences to absent colleagues. Lists of supplies no longer available. But a ship on their doorstep meant, once again, that their small saga might be a thread in a larger tapestry. Rescue, or at least connection, was possible. He wanted to unfurl his chest and allow the joy to arrive. Mara, however, did not allow herself such luxuries. The ship's hail came through their long range. Receiver as a voice that was both unexpected and achingly formal. A woman spoke in the old Earth's administrative accent, a cadence of leadership that suggested both courtesy and authority. "This is the RV Lida, harvesting salvage in Sector 9. We picked up an illicit transponder." "Identify yourselves," Mara responded with a quiet, procedural report. "Outpost ID, scientific designation, maintenance status." The Lida, it turned out, is a salvage and research ship operating with private funding and entity. That thin slice of post-collapse society where commerce and curiosity still held hands. "We have limited capacity," the Lida's captain said. "If there are viable researchers or specimens, we can offer transit. There is a small price." Kellen looked at Mara and saw the micro gesture of calculation. "Transit would mean giving up the outpost," she said aloud. It would mean leaving your experiment," Kellen finished, and the sentence hung like a question. Mara's eyes, which had been soft for weeks, hardened with an honest calculation. "If we take the transit, we might reach enclaves with better infrastructure. Their systems might be able to replicate more chambers, to make gestation safe across more places. Or," she looked at the chamber and then at the archive, "or we stay and risk everything on the hope that a single reinstated gestation program can seed a population here." "Seed a population with a single donor," Kellen said, trying his best to keep his voice neutral. The words tasted odd. You would be shaping an entire species with the echo of one human. Mara's face was a map of options. "We don't pretend to be anything other than heirs," she said. We will not be the same as before, and perhaps that is the point. We will have to accept that crossing species is a compromise. But if we can replicate the scaffold across multiple sites, if we can prime other chambers with similar catalysts, then one donation might not be the only seed. That argument was logical. It persuaded in the way mathematics persuades. But it did not convince Kellen's gut, which had a memory of shame and of people who used others too easily when it benefited their schema. He asked the question less of himself than of the hospital of memory that filled the outpost. What if the human sequence we are using had been taken from someone who didn't agree? What if they didn't consent to be the seed of a new species? Are we not complicit in repeating the mistakes that made us need this gift? Mara did not flinch at the accusation. She had asked for this gift. She had traveled across sighing, lonely voids to find a man who could give it. We can make consent our covenant from now, she said. We can acknowledge our debt to those sequences and build structures of accountability. We can teach our children the truth, not their invented myths. There is a kind of moral argument that counts as practical when survival is on the line, and another kind that insists on ideal forms even when survival is at stake. They sat in that moral algebra for a long time. Kellen saw two futures fold within him, a narrow, selfless one where he leaves and lets the project die so no new beings arise at the cost of a possibly non-consensual act, and a wider, sacrificial one where he agrees and allows his living body to function as a catalyst. The stakes were spun into the fringe of what it means to be human. The scale had become an edict. He chose, and his choice was not cinematic in the way some stories are. He did not raise his voice or offer a speech. He simply pulled up the old release forms in the archive and read aloud the clauses that had been written in a kind of bureaucratic compassion. There were names on the forms, and some had signatures. There were others marked as donor unknown. He found the line referencing HO7 and read the sparse note. Sample obtained under emergency neural sync protocol. Donor identity confidential. Kellen felt something in his chest, like a knot of wiring. We can't know, he said finally. But I can't imagine a universe in which silence is better than action. Nor can I, Mara replied. And the room hummed like a circuit closing. He consented in a way that was practical and precise. A log with his biometric signature. A recorded statement that the archive should keep with its files. He said aloud that he was old, that he had no immediate family, that he understood the possible consequences, that he might alter the lineage of the species inhabiting the planet. He checked the phrases as if inspecting a fire control panel. When he finished the formalities, Mara played back the recording and archived it in the central ledger. He felt oddly cleansed by the administrative ritual, the bureaucracy of consent carrying. With it, the small absolution of clarity. The transformation that followed was both scientific and intimate. It was not that Kellen changed into anything other than himself. Rather, his body functioned as a temporary node in something larger. And the machine that had lain dormant for decades composed its offerings with the economy of an artist. The chamber's careful biocompatible filaments interfaced with his skin at points not unlike acupuncture. Sensors that read biochemical identifiers and warm patches of gel that facilitated the subtle transfer of metabolic nuance. Kellen felt it as a pressure, a small forgetting of the boundaries between himself and the machine. He imagined, irrationally, that it was a kind of joining, a liturgical act between a human past and an alien future. He did not enjoy it in a physical sense, but he did not resent it. It felt solemn and right. When the priming was complete, the chamber stored the combined sequence in its core memory, and then, in a slow cascade of algorithms and physical operations, began to replicate the first embryonic structures. They monitored it as one would a fragile infant. Pings and blooms of electrochemical data came in neat waves. The scaffold stabilized, and the chamber went into a long incubation mode. In those days, the outpost felt like a place on loan to something larger. The algae tanks hummed, the scrubbers sang. When Kellen walked outside at dusk, he could swear the planet itself seemed to inhale and hold it. Weeks bled into months. The first cohort of gestations matured in the chamber's long room like slow-growing pearls. Mara stayed, a small constancy beside the hum. They argued at midnight about ethics and philosophy, and sometimes about silly things books she had never read. Music he had once loved. Those arguments, trivial and intimate, became his anchorage. He had always thought himself an island, but islands sometimes have lighthouses, and he had found one he didn't mind tending. Then, on a gray morning thick with a weather that threatened to smear all edges, their radars lit with a cluster of signals. Ships, this time not a single salvage vessel, but a small convoy, loomed on the edge of the system, like a slow, inexorable tide. The Lyta had called earlier, and now a consortium of enclaves had followed. The communications band crackled with the syntax of diplomatic interest, commercial extraction, and, interestingly, human curiosity. News moved through the networks like a smell before a storm. New gestation success on the Ashplane outpost. Read one message. Hybrid scaffold, primed possible implications for cross-species seeding, read another. It was the sort of announcement that would, in older days, have sent fleets of researchers and priests and politicians to a place. Now it sent a mixture of commercial prospectors and Sheev. High schist. Mara watched the incoming traffic with a smile and a small hidden fear. We will need to be transparent, she said. We will have to open the archive. We will have to show our consent logs, our protocols. The enclaves will want to regulate, perhaps even commandeer. Kellen had difficulty imagining the outpost under the glare of large social attention. He had been, in his own life, a caretaker of solitude. Now the world was interested in his quiet corner. And with that interest came the uncomfortable possibility that their small experiment would be turned into a public show. They prepared as best they could. They retrieved the archive's consent logs and patched the station's uplink to send a packet to the Lyta's command. They wrote and archived and cross-referenced their forms. There was an urge in Kellen to be honest, to the point of self-mortification. The truth had a sharpness that either absolved or ruined. He chose the former when representatives arrived. They were as varied as the enclosed societies of the post-collapse era. There were bureaucrats who smelled faintly of antiseptic and new money, ethicists in thin suits who asked structured questions, and a small contingent of religious observers who believed that life was a sacred chain not to be arbitrarily loosed. The conversations were long and complex. They asked about the origins of the sequences, about consent, about the technical means by which human biology came to be used as a catalyst. Mara spoke with clarity and a disarming candor. Kellen provided his recorded confession and a careful retelling of the chamber's activation. There were technical inspections and an ugly round of public arguments about ownership and the commodification of life, the twist that turned a theoretical ethical debate into personal consequence. Arrived in the most human of shapes, a woman in the delegation who, after the formalities, asked to see Kellen privately. She introduced herself as Dr. Amina Var, a genetic historian. Her eyes were sharp and old in a different way, containing the patient memory of someone who had read 1,000 human lives. She offered Kellen tea in the station's small galley, and once they were seated, she asked a question that none of the official files had demanded. Do you feel like you have been changed? He thought about the question as if it were a new instrument tuned to his interior. He had expected physical aftereffects, strange allergies, unexpected marks on his skin, but there was none of that. The change, if it existed, was more like a rumor in his mind, an echo of something he had done that had the depth to rearrange an ethical horizon. I feel like someone who chose, he said finally, and choices have consequences. Dr. Var nodded. Indeed, you have been generous in ways that are rare. But generosity without oversight can become a new form of extraction. We must ensure that gestations do not become a resource to be mined. The hearings and the inspections were long. They left the station raw with a new legal tenderness. The enclaves would fund replication and help, distribute scaffold replicates to other chambers. But there would be oversight and the formation of a new covenant on reproductive ethics. The public ledger of their choices would be open. In the archives they had, kept Kellen's exact phrasing, Mara's recorded plea would be a part of the historical record. In a way, it felt like closing a loop. In another, it felt like taking the first step onto an unknown field. Months later, in the chamber's inner room, first of the hybrid gestations reached a stage that allowed for the delicate process of introduction to a world. They were not human babies. That had never been the point. Rather, the scaffold had learned from the human catalyst, and had folded that learning into structures that were neither ours nor entirely other. The first creatures that emerged from the pods were small, luminous things. Their skin had a faint vertebrate symmetry, and their eyes were a kind of new architecture of sight, rounded and curious, with slits that recorded light in a way that made Kellen dizzy when he tried to look at them. They blinked like new animals, struggling to calibrate their senses. A small, astonishing noise, neither a cry nor a human laugh, escaped from one, and the room filled with a sound. Kellen had not known he had missed the small, unedited noise of first living. Mara held one in the palms of her hands and laughed. A sound that was at once all her training and the private, disarming happiness of someone who has seen the possibility of an ancient promise fulfilled. She looked at Kellen, and in that look there was a small, dangerous gratitude. "You started something that will outlive us," she said softly. He smiled back, feeling the old strange ache, the human thing that wants to be loved but fears the consequences of love. "Did we make a mistake?" he asked. "Possibly," Mara admitted. "But so did everyone who tried to survive and made somebody else a resource. We are learning from those mistakes now." Their mission shifted, subtly and with the awkwardness of a ship changing course. They became less hermits and more builders. The enclaves provided materials and a network of experimenters who would help replicate the scaffold in other locations. Always under the careful eye of the new ethical framework, Mara worked with them to build consent protocols that demanded public education, community involvement, and the moral clarity of recorded choice. Kellen, who had become an unwitting symbol of a certain sacrificial generosity, found himself in the uncomfortable role of teacher. He wrote logs and gave talks about the cost of survival and the slippery slope of using the living as tools. He turned the archive into a place of public memory, where the full mess of the past could be examined with transparency and humility. As the months turned into seasons, if a world of slow wind and patient algae can be said to have seasons, the outpost changed. It became a locus, not of the old hubris, but of a messy, tentative collaboration. Out of the gestation program came a small cohort of hybrid beings, each with their own unique stitching of gene and algorithm. They were not identical. They showed variances that humanity would have once called imperfections, and then, in a more mature era, called character. They learned to move in the yawning outer spaces, to taste the algae, and to interact with the machines. They developed, with a perplexing speed, small cultural forms of their own, games, melodies, and a quiet humor that made Kellen feel at times like an old man who, despite himself, enjoyed the light lamp of a child's joy. In the slow motion of all this, Kellen aged. He could feel it, bones tightening, the breath shortening, the faces in the archive blurring into a soft paper. But he was not alone in this. To his surprise, he had found a reason to want to wake up in the morning. He had traded the small ceremonies of routine for a more complicated ritual, watching life find its way. That was a kind of redemption he had not budgeted for. On a late autumn day, when the sky had taken on a bruise of purple and the wind smelled of the coming cold, a message flew in from a distant enclave. Another of the seated chambers had gone live, and the replicative protocol was working. The network had moved beyond them. Communities were beginning to host their own gestational sites, always with the transparency Kellen and Mara had demanded. The human catalytic sequence remained rare. The consortia were experimenting with synthetic analogs and with carefully consented donors. The initial moral worry-thay idea that a single human seed might determine the fate of an alien people had been mitigated by a new communal ethic. We will not build life without consent, and we will not hide our histories. Kellen stood one evening in the observation hall, Mara at his side, and watched a group of the hybrid children playing in a patch of sunlight that penetrated the industrial vents like a holy ray through a cathedral. They chased one another in a tangle of limbs and small noises, their forms awkward and terrifying and beautiful. He felt a pride that was more than personal. It was the fierce, protective pride of someone who had been given the chance to keep a promise he had never been asked to make and had, in the act, been given an inheritance. "You changed everything," Mara said, her voice low. He turned to her, feeling the lines of age at the corners of his mouth, as if they were maps of a life that had finally found its destination. "We did what we could," he said. "We tried to make sure the next mistake would be acknowledged if it came." She smiled then, a small human expression he had watched grow on her face over their time together. "And you taught us a new kind of courage," she said. "Not the grand kind that moves armies, but the stubborn kind that keeps the lamps lit and reads the old files." They sat together, in their slow domestic peace, and spoke of small things because large things had been spoken of loudly enough. Mara asked Kellen, in a way that suggested both curiosity and a tentative affection, whether he wanted to see what their children would become in 10 years. "Will you stay?" she asked. He thought of the archive and the chamber and the vials sealed in quiet dignity. He thought of the sequences and the people whose names would at some point be sung with gratitude or with regret. He thought of the small hybrid child who had once tilted its head and made a noise like a question. "Yes," he said simply. He had no illusions about immortality. He had no romantic illusions left. But he had a small, stubborn desire to be witness, to be present for the future they had paid for with sacrifices both public and intimate in the years that followed. The outpost became a place noted not for its isolation, but for its humility. People came with questions and left with unsettled certainties. The hybrid cohort, now adolescent, developed culture and language that borrowed from the old human idioms they had been taught and from the new ecological logics they had fashioned. They were not angels, and they were not monsters. They were, in the simplest sense, alive. Kellen grew older. He developed a small cough in the winters, and his hearing dulled in the high frequencies. He stopped sleeping through the alarms at night, and woke sometimes with the taste of salt in his mouth and the memory of a machine humming against his skin. But he was content in a way a man becomes when he knows that his life, small and imperfect, has threaded itself into something that will persist on the last night, that the story has room for, though there are always many last nights, and not all of them are truly final. Kellen stood beneath the archive ceiling and watched the holographic stars spin in the dome. He remembered with the ineffable clarity of the old, the first day the woman had come through his hatch and asked for shelter. He remembered the small, ridiculous bureaucracies of consent he had performed, and the childlike humming of a machine that had, in its long and patient way, learned to sing again. Mara came to him then, older too, but in a way that fit the lines of her life. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. "Do you regret letting the cord be struck?" That small human sequence within the scaffold. Kellen thought about the people whose genomes had been used, the bureaucratic neatness of forms signed with trembling hands, the children that ran like small wild things around the outpost. He thought about the ethics boards and the public hearings and the little rules they had carved together, like a fragile exoskeleton around a new life. "If I regret anything," he said at last, "it is that we did not do this sooner, and that we have so much more to learn about thinking of life as something you do with consent and not to. But regret is a teacher, and we have become skilled students." She smiled then, a small private thing like the curve of a horizon. "Then we can continue learning," she said. They sat together for a long time. The archive hummed its quiet machine song around them. Outside, the planet's wind had slowed to the patient breath it used to mark dawn. New ships came sometimes with offers and sometimes with threats, but the outpost had learned to hold both with an even hand. Children who could have been monsters if the old hubris had reigned instead learned to be good citizens of a curious world. The narrative, if it can be called that, because narrative implies a tidy bow, and life rarely offers such close not with an apocalyptic revelation, but with a modest, honest scene. Mara grown into a leader of a small confederation of enclaves, standing at the window and watching an adolescent hybrid teach a group of children a song that's been cobbled together from human lullabies and the new rhythm of their planet. Kellen, who had been the unlikely key to this small evolution, sat at a table with a mug of algae tea and a book open to a page with a poem about rivers that refused to dry. He turned a page and, in the slow adult voice of a man who had been given a second kind of life, read aloud. The story is not neat enough to end with all questions solved. There are still disputes about ownership and the ethics of cross-species exchange in the galactic fora. There will be future mistakes. None of this will be perfect. And there will be moments when the weight of what they did will press tight against the ribs of conscience. But within the outposts, within the archive, the daily act of watching life continue became its own salvation. Kellen's last recorded thought, filed into the archive with the other human files, was simple, and as all final human statements are, both plaintive and brave. We tried to be honest, he wrote. We made a covenant out of consent and care. We did not pretend to be gods. We were gardeners who kept a lamp lit for a long time. If my body mattered to the making of a future, then let that future be told. Let our mistakes be in the open, so the children may learn to fold compassion into their bones. I am only one man, but one man who chose to give when it counted. Mara. In the subsequent log, when she had become leader and a teacher and had folded the outposts into a network of careful communities, echoed that sentiment with a longer humility. We were given a sequence by accident, and we turned it into the architecture of our ethics. For that we are responsible. We will teach our children to understand how they came into being, and we will not let them be made into monuments without context. We will say the names of those who were used, and we will honor them by ensuring. Every new life is born with consent and truth. Last image is not one of fireworks or empire, but of a small hand something between a child's grip and a fledgling's curiosity, reaching to touch Kellen's weathered palm. The contact is brief, but full of gravity. He smiles at the tiny fingers and senses in the final, slow inventory of living, that he has been useful in a way that did not require heroics. He had kept the lights on, read the old files, and in doing so, had allowed a new kind of life to enter the world of fragile, honest life that would carry the story forward with both gratitude and a responsibility to remember. Outside, the sky shifted, and the wind carried the sound of someone laughing. The archive, the chamber. The outposts, they were not the last words in the universe, but one modest paragraph of a continuing book. It was not a perfect conclusion. Life rarely rewards the neat end. But it was a conclusion honest enough to keep the faith that had been asked of them, that to be human is to be responsible for your choices, especially the ones that make others live.